Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Steve Jones joins me, and we talk about how AirPods, iPhones, and Apple Watch have been overhauled to emphasize Siri in the new digital ecosystem. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Steve Jones, Distinguished Professor of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Jones has a Ph.D. For Communications Research at University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and he's the co-founder of the Association of Internet Researchers, the editor of the Journal for New Media and Society, and the editor of Digital Formations, a series of books on new media. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought maybe we could start by talking about the changes that are going on with Apple, with their new AirPods and their iPhone and their Apple Watch, which I understand have all been enhanced and retooled to create what they're calling a kind of a digital ecosystem.
Yeah, I think we're being enhanced and retooled.
We are, okay, yeah, because we're in the middle of it,
well,
right?
I mean, so part of, one of the interesting things about this is, and an ecosystem is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And people tend to talk about it as an ecosystem within a particular brand or company. So, the Apple ecosystem or the Google, Android or Microsoft. But it's really only partially about the commercial prospects. It's also about engaging us throughout our everyday life with these devices for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to downplay the degree to which these are commercial reasons, like collecting data about what we do and then using that data in some fashion, either to sell to advertisers or directly to us or what. But it's also to try to sort of get a handle on quantifying what we do. And sometimes that's really beneficial, like cases in which the Apple Watch has found people who have atrial fibrillation or other heart issues. The Apple Watch has alerted them and said, you need to go to an emergency room right away, and it's probably saved some lives that way. So there are some good aspects to this, but it can start to feel a little bit constraining and a little bit intrusive, and the privacy issues do need to come to the fore whenever you discuss having these, wearing these devices 24/7 virtually.
So the purpose for using these devices is not so they can collect data on us, but so that they can assist us, right? So we can ask questions and get answers.
It's some of each, right? And I don't know that we'll ever be able to kind of put our finger on how much of each.
Yeah.
Anytime we use these devices, we are feeding data back. Now, Apple is generally pretty good at kind of cordoning off the data that it collects and not letting it leave those devices unless we permit it. Other companies, maybe not so much. I would point the finger at Google somewhat, because they really live and die by the data they collect and then process and create. And we get a lot of good things from that. The algorithms they create do have some benefits, but the commercial aspect of this is not to be underplayed.
So the consumer is buying this as an aid, so that you can say, Siri, put this on my calendar, or what are the things I have to do today, or add this to my to-do list,
you've walked your 8,000 of your 10,000 steps, and it'll remind you, you need to get a little more exercise today to reach your goals. And in that sense, it can nudge you towards some positive behaviors, which is wonderful. I mean, there are some very good potential health benefits from using some of these things.
If I'm not aware of it, I'm thinking that these devices that I'm using are just helping me, but they're also recording my habits and things like that. And in some cases, they're feeding them back to the corporate offices of Google or something, right, wherever they're going.
The big machine.
And they're putting together not only a profile of me, but maybe a profile of, of human nature, right?
Right. I mean, so part of the goal with this is not just the kind of personalization which is an important aspect to those companies in terms of delivering things that might be of value to us individually. But it's also aggregating all this data to better understand how people generally do particular things. The most obvious example for almost all of us is driving behaviors. Apple Maps, Google's Maps do a terrific job of not just estimating travel times, but updating that in real time. And how do they do this? They do this because they can see the signal as it passes through different cell towers, so they know the relative speed at which traffic is moving. And that's
one of the great benefits of
it's
having
useful,
these devices.
right? Yeah, I mean, you sort of think back to how did we ever do this before we had these things? And you didn't. You'd have to guesstimate.
It'll tell me, there's a traffic jam ahead of you, and I'll get off the expressway at the next ramp.
Well, and it'll tell you where to get, right?
It'll say if I want, it'll tell me that. But it always surprises me that there are only 3 or 4 of us getting off. It's like, don't the rest of these people know that they could be avoiding this problem? And then, of course, once everybody's avoiding the problem, it's just going to shift to another street, right?
Yeah, actually, it's funny you bring that up, because I was one of the probably hundreds of thousands, if not more, who were stuck, was about a year and a half ago, in traffic returning from viewing the eclipse.
Oh.
And having GPS and having those maps was completely useless, because everybody was trying to figure out alternative routes.
So the people that went to see the eclipse were all people that were savvy about having these phones and
I think they were a little sort of sciencey that way.
Yeah, right.
So
interesting. So you were acting as
there was a traffic jam on every little side road in Illinois as everybody was trying to get back to Chicago. It was a mess.
So this is really, I guess it's kind of, I think of this in terms of systems theory or cybernetic processes. These devices are part of a network that is learning every day, right? And it's absorbing information, and it's using that to compute what it's going to do in the future, essentially, right?
Yeah, and this really does harken back to cybernetic theory from nearly, well, I guess not quite 100 years ago, but 80 years ago, as it started to be developed. And the idea really is to get to the point where there is enough data to be sufficiently predictive, so that the machines can make some good guesses. Now, where you're seeing this predominantly right now is in the financial sector, in terms of doing things like stock trading, the commodity markets. Probably, I think I just saw this a few days ago, that over half of trades right now in the stock market are done by machines.
Well, they're processed by machines, or the machine is calling the trade.
Calling the shots.
Really?
Yeah, because presumably there's now enough data that it not only collects in real time, but that it has stored in the same way that machines have started to outdo humans in chess, in Go, and other games.
Yeah.
The stock market, in that sense, is a bit of a game. And so the machines now have a pretty good track record at executing trades and making those decisions.
That's a lot more sophisticated than my phone telling me it's going to take me 37 minutes to get to work on a given day.
It is, but it's the same principle. And the interesting thing, of course, for me is, it can be that predictive, but humans are not that predictable at the end of the day. Right. So there are going to be those moments where there are going to be some issues and mistakes, and I think it's always useful to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. I mean, when your maps tell you, go in this direction, maybe you actually do know a little bit better because you've been doing this for years, or you see something. It's not going to have that knowledge yet. I mean, at some point you can imagine, well, this is going to be tied to a camera, but it's not going to have that knowledge that it can make that immediate decision. So there's still, I don't think it's going to quite take over yet.
Well, in your case, when you were coming back from the eclipse, you could have said, you know what, I'll bet everybody's following their phone. I'm going to go a different direction, right?
I tried that. The problem was there's so darn much traffic going north.
Other people anticipated that as well.
Yeah, you can only second guess so many times before you just give up.
Yeah. So they're trying to recreate something that's similar to human cognition in these machines, essentially, right? What does it's probably a very broad subject, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what does the study of cognitive psychology lend to this, and what is this telling us about cognitive psychology? Because I'm sure there's some trade-offs there, right?
So one of the interesting areas in which we're starting to see technological development is in what is known as social robotics. Essentially, the development of robots that are companions. And this is particularly prevalent in Japan, where there's a really large cohort of the elderly for whom there are not quite enough caregivers. And so to combat loneliness, to combat the inability of people to be there 24/7, a lot of development's taking place there where, in some cases, little desktop-sized sort of robots or sort of not quite full-size, but 4-foot-tall robots. I'm thinking here of the SoftBank Pepper device, or my favorite, which is actually a sort of a robot pet. It's called Paro, P-A-R-O, and it's in the shape of a baby seal.
I've seen this. Yeah,
and it's perfectly sort of, it's adorable, right? And it's soft, but it will do things like assess heart rate, assess body temperature, assess stability, whether somebody's moving with it and whether they're kind of wobbling, or maybe they'll have a fall. So these things are, and typically the elderly people who have these develop an attachment to them as if they're a pet.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of these psychosocial benefits to them too. And that's kind of the interesting intersection here of cognitive psychology and social robotics, is that we are now seeing people developing relationships with devices, for lack of a better term.
Right.
I mean, you can sort of see a progression here.
And people talked about their cars like that, I suppose.
Right, exactly.
Guitar players and their guitar, right?
And you name, we name ships, we'll name cars. Yeah. We sort of anthropomorphize a lot of things. But now these things talk back to us, right? And they get to know us, and they know where we've been. Toyota has, of all things, a robot that it's developing that will remember places you've been and will make suggestions and say, oh, we've been here before, you like this restaurant, or those kind of things. So there is a degree now to which this is companionship rather than just
They're not going to start nagging us or anything like that, right?
I don't know.
Telling us what to do.
Well, I mean, to the extent that your watch tells you that you need to get in a few more steps, that's a little bit nagging.
I was so happy when I got my first smartphone. I didn't have to wear a watch anymore, and now people are wearing both.
That's
that doesn't
back to
make
the
any
watch,
sense to me. But I read about a survey that said that 41% of people who use voice assistants say that they refer to it as their friend. And so that's, I think, an example of what you're talking about there, right? I mean, and that's just maybe their phone or
their Alexa device.
Yeah, the Alexa device. Yeah.
There's a degree to which, again, I sort of trace this back to some extent to the Tamagotchi, the little it was a little LCD screen device, again developed in Japan, and you would have to check in with it regularly for it to kind of stay alive. And if you didn't, it would die. It would literally croak on you. Right. And the fact that these are now with us virtually 24/7, and they speak to us, and we get accustomed to them. They are like friends in that way.
So, do you think we're learning anything about how we think from watching the development of these things?
So I think the jury's kind of still out. I think what's going to be interesting is to see how young children develop this.
Yeah.
What's going to so when kids today see their parents or other adults speaking to devices, and in a somewhat demanding tone, right? Alexa, turn off the lights, or and you don't even say please.
Some people are saying please and thank you, I read too.
The more polite among us, I'd like to think, are kind of upholding some standards.
Yeah, good, that's good, yeah.
But how are kids going to have the expectation as they grow older that everything's going to respond to voice? I doubt it. I mean, I don't want to blow this up into kind of a panic about, oh my heavens.
No, but that's an interesting point, because if we are spending that much time communicating with these devices and we develop certain patterns of behavior in doing that, it seems logical that some of that's going to leak over into how we're treating one another.
You would expect. And there were somewhat, I think, again, kind of blown out of proportion, but if you go back just 10 years to stories of little children who, at a very early age, had an iPad. Maybe they, were given the parents, and so they were used to swiping and so on, and then they would get a book, and they would swipe, and couldn't understand why nothing was happening. Right? Why isn't this responding? It's just, why isn't this piece of paper doing it? I think to some extent, the thing is, kids are extraordinarily smart and resilient, far more so than adults give them credit for. So they'll get it. But I think there will be an extent to which a world in which you speak to things is normal for them. And if you don't, so imagine as they get older and maybe get a car, if their car doesn't have some sort of voice-enabled system, that's going to seem a little old-fashioned. Why doesn't it have that? Is that an antique? It's a vintage car.
We've sort of gone through this already a little bit with a lot of these electronic devices, like, say, DVD players. I notice, for instance, if I'm selecting, say I want to select Netflix or something, I'll select Netflix and I'll say, okay, I want this movie, right? Oh, you know what it is, Voodoo. So I'll say to Voodoo, I want this movie. It'll say, do you want to pay for this movie? Say, I'll pay for it. And then it says, would you like to watch it now? And then I say, yes, I want to watch it now. And then it says, you're sure you want to watch it now? It's just there's these series of commands you have to go through. You want to turn the machine off. It's like, would you like to turn the machine off? Yes. Should I turn it off now? Right? And you've got to tell it like 3 times. Where in the old days, you flipped a switch. And it was over. But now and really this goes back 20 years, right? We're engaging these devices in essentially a conversation, right? Before we can get them to do what we want.
It's interactive, but not in the sense that we used to use that term 10 or more years ago. It's now an interpersonal interaction with those devices.
I mean, if I was at a DVD store and I walked up to the counter with a DVD, the person wouldn't say, do you want to buy this? Right?
Do you want to rent this? Do you want to rent it now?
Yeah, you want to rent it now? Anyway, I don't know why those things develop that way, but it seems that that's the most common interaction.
I think part of there's a lot of interesting work being done in the design realm, where people will try to figure out, how will sort of the average user, whatever that means, do these things. And the goal is often to not just anticipate how users, and then there's a lot of trialing of these things. But it's also to anticipate what might anger the user. Right? You want to avoid, so one of the things to avoid, of course, is people buying stuff inadvertently. Not only would that get the user angry, but then they would, even if they keep the service, then you'd have to contact somebody in customer service, get a refund, and so it adds a lot to the chain. So I think they're trying to figure out, how do you do this in a fashion that's somewhat efficient, but not so much that people might skip a step or might not understand what's going on.
Yeah, so which kind of drives them towards preparing things for the lowest common denominator a lot of times, right? Something else I read recently, there was a survey taken with young people. I forget what the age was. It might have been millennials. But I think it said that the majority of them, or almost the majority of them, felt that their smartphones were a burden. They didn't see them as something that was necessarily pleasurable or desirable. They felt like it was something that tied them down, almost like maybe someone who's been sentenced to stay in their house wearing one of those leg bracelets, right?
Monitor.
Is that really how people are starting to look at these things? I'm still fascinated by my phone. I'm excited every time I update the software. I want to see what new things are on there. But are people getting kind of burned out by all this?
Yeah, there is a degree of burnout, but there's not a backlash. So I think there are some frustrations. But what I've seen, and this is again particularly among young people, is kind of movement toward more seemingly efficient ways of communicating and less intrusive ones. How do you avoid getting, so a migration away initially from email toward text, and then from text toward Snapchat, and from Facebook to maybe Slack. And so there's a way in which I think people make, and again, particularly young people, make very conscious decisions about what technologies to engage, both in terms of hardware and software.
Yeah.
They're not slaves to these devices. And when they do get frustrated, and this is something, if you are an Apple or a Google or what have you, that you really have to have kind of at very much, kind of front of mind is, what are those frustrations and how do you design around them?
Yeah.
Because now, not only are these are no longer merely personal devices, you're required to use them in your work. Most workplaces have used some form of social media, whether that's Slack for work groups, or in some cases, private Facebook groups or what have you. So this isn't just for fun anymore. This becomes part of your work day. It becomes something that you're attending to after work. And yeah, it could really feel like it is a burden.
A faculty member was just telling me she, was emailing a student all semester, telling him, you haven't turned anything in yet, and he just got a hold of her and said he hadn't seen the emails. And I hear this a lot. I think at the universities we expect students to be checking their email all the time, but it may not be as important to them as it is to us. And it may no longer be the main way we communicate with them when they're not here. When it used to be, a really handy tool.
Yeah, no, my students and my kids too, when I say, I'll send you an email, kind of look at me like, wow, you're old.
Yeah,
it's a bit of an old-fashioned technology, and the fact is, it's one of the oldest when it comes to the internet.
What about the future of this in terms of politics and social media? What sorts of things do you anticipate?
Yeah, it's interesting the degree to which we've kind of found people weaponizing social media. It had been the case that advertising was a terrific way to reach particular audiences, and now Facebook and other social media give you such fine-grained connection to individuals, not just sort of groups of people, under 18s or whatever, but literally individuals, and the degree to which we're going to be able to control its use in that sort of weaponized fashion to try to get messages that may or may not be true, and that will be hard for the average person to determine whether they are or not true, is only going to increase, I think, particularly in this next presidential campaign.
Do you anticipate we'll be entertaining laws to restrict how some of this can be used? Because then we run into the free speech issue, right?
Yeah, there is an extent to which some types of speech are not protected. Yes, we have free speech laws, but they're generally in conjunction with government intervention. But we have restrictions on advertising, for instance. Yeah. So the degree to which political speech, political campaigns are introducing messages could, I think, easily be considered as a form of advertising and subject to regulations that individual speech are not.
We've got to close in a second here, but what might have been done to alleviate some of the issues that came up in the last presidential race, for instance, if that were being policed more carefully? Well,
so I think one of the things that could have been done is that the social media platforms themselves could have been far more alert to where some of these messages were coming from, that they weren't coming from the U.S. as they were purported to be, that they were coming from state agents, not just companies, individuals, think tanks, what have you, and that there was an attempt to influence people's election behavior.
Yeah. Well, all communication's an attempt to influence, probably.
So to some degree, it's all persuasion.
Yeah. Another issue, if we could just touch on it for a second, is multitasking. There's been some reporting on this that if you're hands-free and you're on the phone, you're just as distracted as if you were actually holding a phone. And I know some people are concerned that if you're going through your house talking to Siri or something, you're actually multitasking, and the other things that should be going on in your life are going to get less of your attention. Do you see that as a potential problem?
There's a wonderful novel from the 1960s, might be the 70s, by Jerzy Kosinski called Being There.
Yes, I remember that.
And a wonderful film of it, too. And the premise of it was that wherever there's a screen, that's where we are, right? Because our attention is focused on that. And you could sort of see this almost anywhere you go. Yeah. Airports are a wonderful example. Yeah. Anywhere there's a screen, people's eyes, it's a magnet for the eyes. And so to some extent, it does, any screen, any device takes us a little bit away from our presence in place. How much is it how much is it a problem? It depends on the individual circumstance. I sure don't
How
want to be
often it
looking at my
happens,
phone
right?
as I'm crossing the street.
Yeah, well, I've done that. Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. I want to thank Dr. Steve Jones for joining us today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.